Satan, Lucifer, the morning star, and the fall of Egypt. Today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Ezekiel chapter 28 through 31. Tomorrow we're going to go through Ezekiel 32 through 34. Now I must apologize in advance for the tardiness of this video. I was under the weather yesterday and I'm not feeling much better today either. So I'll try to get through this as promptly as possible, as long as my voice holds up. So, Ezekiel 28. Does this talk about Satan? Well, let's get into it and let's find out. This is about the fall of Tyre's ruler, and then a lament for Tyre's king, and also a prophecy against Sidon here. So the ruler of Tyre here can probably be identified as either Ithobal II, whose name meant Baal is with him, or Ethbal III. It's possibly the language was kept vague here so that the condemnation could aptly describe any Tyrian king. And I'm assuming that's probably the case. It could be any Tyrian king, but my guess would be it would be referring to the last one that would have been the king in 332 when Alexander took over. But verses 3 through 5, of course, it mentions Daniel. You are wiser than Daniel. No secret is hidden from you. It's clear that the fame of the prophet Daniel had spread during the exile, even beyond the bounds of his own people, because here we are talking about Daniel in Ezekiel, who is another prophet. Your heart has become proud because of your wealth. That pride always comes before the fall, doesn't it? We move on into the lament for Tyre's king, and that starts in verse 11 through verse 19. And this is where people think that it talks about Lucifer. Now, the prideful king of Tyre is compared either to a guardian angel at the mountain of God or to an errant Adam in the Garden of Eden by some scholars, because of course they're talking about that he was there. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every kind of precious stone covered you, and it listed those. 9 of the 12 precious gemstones were listed here, were included on the high priest's breastpiece. If you remember that from Exodus chapter 28, and also Exodus chapter 39, it mentioned the high priest's breastplate and the different jewels that were on that, seated in gold. We get to 14 through 17, and the context is an oracle against the king of Tyre. Many believe that this part, this anointed cherub, so to speak, should ultimately be identified as Satan himself. In that case, the passage would indeed have a double reference. So, here we are. There's all kinds of stuff that you can find on the internet about this double reference. And also the double reference is not just solely included in Ezekiel, it's also included in Isaiah that we have read in Isaiah chapter 14. So Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 both are considered to have the downfall of Satan or Lucifer being thrown out of heaven as their reference points here. Of course, you can find slides like this. I'm not going to go through every single one of these because you've already done the reading for yourself. So I'm just going to pop these up on the screen. If you want to pause these and read these as why people feel that these are double references, you may. Like I said, it starts in verse 11 and goes through 17, verse 13 here. This was, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Some people think this is a reference to Adam who fell from his perfection, but some people say, no, this was Satan, who was a guardian of the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, you got verse 14. Satan was a guardian angel. You, a winged creature, were installed as a guardian. And, of course, pride before the fall. You became too proud to be of your beauty. You ruined your wisdom because of your greatness. I threw you down to the ground. Your example taught a lesson to other kings. To me, that's more human-based than it is Satan-based, because this king fell. This king sat in his little castle in his kingdom there on the island of Tyre, and no one for hundreds of years was able to attack him and defeat him until Alexander came along. And, of course, the demon authorities that saw Satan fall out. So, clearly, there is a lot of speculation about this. Now, some people say that this was all about Lucifer. Some people say, no, 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 this was all about King Tyre. My guess is this is probably a comparison of the fall of Lucifer with the fall of Tyre together. I don't think that it's really just specifically one or the other. I think it's a blend of both, and I'm seeing that when you look in Isaiah 14, there's some scholars that say this has nothing to do with Lucifer. But if you look at Isaiah 14 and you start in verse 12, it says shining morning star, which is clearly defined as Lucifer. Lucifer was the shining and morning star. Then later on he became Satan, which was the one who was rebellious or deceitful. Shining morning star, how you have fallen from the heavens, you destroyer of nations, you have been cut down to the ground. You said yourself, I will ascend to the heavens, I will set up my throne above the stars of God, I will sit on the mount of God's assembly. This is Satan saying he's going to go back up there and take over, essentially, is what people interpret this as if you just read it by itself. But if you put it in the context of the whole chapter, this is definitely the downfall of the king of Babylon. It's talking about Babylon and him reaching for those heights. Then the end of this chapter, of course, we get to Sidon, the downfall of prophecy against Sidon. And this was another key Phoenician port city. It was located 25 miles north of Tyre, and Sidon and Tyre often are mentioned together in the Bible. And during times when Tyre was in decline, Sidon would increase in its prominence. So in the Persian period, Sidon actually stood at the head of the Phoenician cities. So we'll move on to chapter 29. This was the beginning of the 7 oracles against Egypt. In other words, the downfall of Egypt in 7 different sections. Chapter 29 has 2 of these oracles listed. Chapter 30 has 2 oracles listed. Chapter 31 is 1 oracle in itself. And tomorrow, of course, we're going to read the last 2 of those oracles that are in chapter 32, the final downfall of Egypt. So Egypt was Israel's constant foe after keeping the nation in bondage for 400 years during its early history. We know that. But Ezekiel's first oracle here against Egypt is dated January 587 BC, where Hophra was the pharaoh. We get to verse 7, and Egypt's guilt stemmed from its pact to assist King Zedekiah of Judah and its defiance of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar is God's tool to fulfill his wrath, the agent of God's wrath, of course, against Judah. By resisting Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh Hophra was hindering the execution of God's plan. Never going to stop it, but he's tried to slow it down. Didn't happen. His attack against Nebuchadnezzar in the spring of 588 BC, of course, failed to relieve Jerusalem. Get to verse 12, and in the Bible here, in chapter 29, verse 12, in the Bible, 40 years is a very frequent expression that's used for a complete and lengthy period of time. It doesn't always end up being exactly 40 years, but that's an expression for a long length of time. If Egypt fell to the Babylonians in 568 BC, as most ancient Near Eastern histories maintain, then this 40-year captivity of Egypt ended when the Persians came to power. So after the Babylonians were defeated and the Persians seized control of Egypt, and was never again a formidable world power. And even today, they're really not a spectacular superpower by any means. Nebuchadnezzar labored over Tyre, of course, but he received no plunder. He was there for 13 years, was never able to finish killing off the Tyrians, and instead the Lord gave Egypt to him as compensation for all of his labors and work as God's instrument of wrath, so to speak. So we're going to move on to chapter 30 at this point. Chapter 30, it talks about Pharaoh's broken arm, of course. We get through here. This is Egypt's doom. So I found a picture of a statue that's supposed to be a representation of a pharaoh, and of course the arms are broken off. How appropriate is that? We get to verses 6 through 12, and ruin would even come on Egypt's allies. And Cush, its neighbors, would tremble in fear. Foreigners would bring desolation on Egypt. It was a pretty bad thing. Verse 20, in the 11th year, in the first month, on the 7th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. So when is that? The date formula indicates that this oracle was announced shortly before the fall of Jerusalem, The date may allude to Pharaoh Hophra's attempt to intervene to deliver Judah from the crisis that they were going through. And then in verses 21 through 26, the figurative expressions, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, refers to Nebuchadnezzar's defeat of Hophra, who attempted to relieve Jerusalem. Now we're going to move on to chapter 31, the last chapter here. And the cedar is mentioned here. And this is almost an entire chapter that's referencing the cedar and its branches and how it grows and how big it is and its shade and its limbs. The abundant water that was around it. The cedar was renowned as an ancient symbol of the Near Eastern royalty and majesty. In the Bible, it's frequently mentioned in texts describing the production of palaces and temples. The fall of Assyria forms the precedent and the paradigm for the fall of Egypt. This fifth oracle against Egypt is dated around June of 587 BC. We get to verses 10 through 14, and because of the tree representing the Pharaoh had become prominent, in other words, towered high in stature, as it says here, it would be cut down. So we get to verse 18. This is the end of chapter 31. And the trees would die disgracefully as uncircumcised foreigners without a decent burial. This reality would be particularly poignant for Egyptian royalty because they built pyramids in the hopes of making themselves comfortable in the afterlife. So they built these big, huge pyramids here just so they could be entombed in there and be a nice, comfy, cozy for all eternity, yet didn't happen. And tomorrow we will continue on for the rest of the downfall of Egypt for the last two of these oracles. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button, subscribe button, and click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And also hit that little boxing glove so you can rumble with me on Rumble. And we'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.